His family ignored his birthday until he read the letter hidden in his mailbox. It was his birthday, and by 7 in the evening, Frank had already cleared away his own cake plate, untouched. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe if you love meaningful stories, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I really enjoy seeing where these stories travel. He'd waited all day. The phone sat on the edge of the table like it always did, the volume turned up, the ringer unmissable. Nothing. Not a call from his daughter. Not a text from the grandkids. He refreshed his email 3 times. Still nothing. At first, he told himself they were just busy. Work, school, life. But by the time the sun dipped below the line of trees out back, the silence had grown heavier. He stood in the kitchen, rinsing off the plate he'd pulled from the cabinet that morning. It had a faint chip on the edge, one he never bothered to fix. He'd used the same plate for 20 years. The meal had been quiet, a small roast, nothing fancy. He didn't even bother lighting the candle on the table. He poured a glass of sweet tea, sat in his chair, and ate while the evening news droned on in the background. It was easier to let the sound fill the room than to sit in the kind of silence that made you question things. By habit, he slipped on his jacket after dinner and stepped outside to check the mailbox. He hadn't expected much. A bill, maybe a flyer, something from the dentist's office. The street was still, the porch light buzzing faintly. He walked to the end of the drive, opened the mailbox, and pulled out a handful of envelopes. There was one near the bottom that made him stop. It was plain white. No return address. His name written across the front in neat, careful handwriting. Not typed, not stamped. Handwritten. That alone was enough to make him pause. He stood there for a minute, thumbing the corner of the envelope. The handwriting wasn't familiar. No postal marks. It had been placed there, not delivered. He glanced around the quiet street. No one in sight. No movement. He brought it inside and sat at the table again. Slipped the letter opener through the flap. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. He unfolded it slowly. There were only 10 words. I know today matters. You're not forgotten. Look under the bench. His heart tapped a little harder against his ribs. He set the letter down, read it again, then again. No signature. No hint at who it might be from. Just a message that felt like it had been written directly to the part of him that had spent the whole day feeling invisible. He stood up, left the letter on the table, and stepped back out onto the porch. The bench sat just beside the door. It had been there for decades. He and Helen had picked it out one Saturday morning at the hardware store. She wanted something wooden. He wanted something comfortable. They settled on the one with the iron armrests and the slatted back. She added cushions later, but those had long since been packed away. Frank bent down slowly, his knees stiff with age and disuse. He looked beneath the bench, expecting to find nothing. Just the old leaves that had blown underneath over the winter. But there it was, a small, neatly wrapped package. Brown paper, twine. Taped underneath the slats like someone had taken great care to keep it hidden, but safe. He reached for it slowly, his fingers brushing dust from the edges. He held it in his hands for a long moment before going back inside. He set it down gently next to the letter, unsure what to make of any of it. Someone knew. Someone had remembered. He unwrapped it carefully, the twine coming loose with a tug. The paper folded back to reveal a photograph. Faded. Old. A snapshot from what looked like the 1970s. Frank sitting on a dock, his arm around Helen, both of them smiling, young, happy. Beneath the photo, a short note. You taught me how to show up for people. This is me showing up for you. Frank leaned back in his chair, the photo in one hand, the note in the other. He didn't speak, didn't move. He just sat there, the weight of the silence replaced by something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He had no idea who sent it, but for the first time that day, he didn't feel forgotten. Frank left the photograph on the table and stared at it for a long time. The picture had been taken during one of those summers when time moved slower. The dock was from a lake they used to visit every July. Helen loved that place. She used to pack lunch in a cooler and bring along the old thermos filled with lemonade. Frank remembered the way her sundress fluttered in the breeze, how she always sat with her knees pulled up, her toes brushing the water. That photo must have been taken by someone they trusted, maybe one of the friends they used to camp with, though the face behind the camera was now a blur in his memory. He picked up the envelope again and studied the handwriting. It was clean, deliberate. Someone had taken their time with it. The letter didn't have a date. It didn't have a name. Just those 10 words. And now the photo. And the line about showing up. Frank stood and made his way to the bench again. He crouched down and checked under the slats, wondering if there was anything he'd missed. But there was nothing else. Just the shape of the dust where the package had been. He straightened up slowly, joints protesting, and sat down. The bench creaked under his weight. He looked out at the street. Still quiet. A few porch lights glowing across the way. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. He sat there for a while, listening, watching. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone had come and gone without him noticing. Someone who knew that today had mattered. Back inside, Frank poured himself a glass of water and sat at the table. The house was quiet, but different now. It wasn't just the silence of being alone. It was the kind of silence that follows an unanswered question. He looked at the photo again. Whoever sent it had to have known him from a long time ago. That photo wasn't new. That wasn't something someone could have found online. It was from a box. Maybe one they'd looked through together. Or maybe someone had taken a copy all those years back without saying much about it. But why now? He opened the drawer beside him and pulled out a pen and paper. It was old habit. Frank had always believed in writing things down, especially when they felt too big to hold in your head. He wrote the date at the top of the page, then paused. Then he started writing. To whoever left the note, thank you. He paused again. I wasn't expecting anything today. Truth is, I didn't think anyone would remember. You did. And I don't know how or why, but it meant more than you probably realize. He stared at the letter. There was no address, no place to send it. But the mailbox had worked once. Maybe it would again. He folded the note, slipped it into an envelope, and simply wrote, "For you," on the front. Then he walked out under the porch light and left it in the same place the first letter had appeared. He stood there for a moment, looking at the mailbox. It felt strange, like he was stepping into a conversation that had already started. One he didn't know he needed until now. He went back inside and turned off the lights. Sat down in his recliner, still holding the photograph. He looked at Helen's smile. At the version of himself he barely recognized. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like maybe the past hadn't gone silent after all. Maybe someone out there had been listening, remembering, waiting for the right moment to speak up. And maybe, just maybe, this birthday wasn't over yet. The letter stayed in the mailbox overnight. Frank checked first thing the next morning, coffee mug still in hand. It was gone. He stood at the edge of his driveway in slippers and a faded flannel, holding the mailbox door open longer than he needed to. It didn't make sense. No mail truck had come yet. It was too early. The sun hadn't even cleared the tops of the trees. And yet the envelope, plain, unsealed, addressed only "for you," was gone. He looked up and down the street. Same stillness. The neighbor's flag rustled a little. The wind was light, but steady. A few birds flitted across the fence line, but otherwise, nothing. No footsteps in the gravel, no tire marks. Frank returned to the house slowly. He set his mug down, sat at the table, and stared at the photo again. The same one that had come in the package. He'd left it on the placemat, not ready to tuck it away. It felt like a thread, something connecting him to whoever had written those words. He wasn't in a rush. That's something age gives you. He knew better than to try and force the answer. But he also knew this wasn't a coincidence. Someone had planned this, thought it through, and it wasn't just a kind gesture. It was intentional, personal. Later that morning, he pulled a plastic container down from the hall closet, the one Helen had labeled Lake House Summers. The writing was still visible in blue marker, slightly smudged. Frank set the bin on the floor and opened it. Inside were years of photos, postcards, old maps, folded napkins with directions scribbled in ink. Most of it hadn't been touched in decades. He flipped through the stacks slowly, sorting, remembering. There it was, the original photo. Same dock, same smile, same sunlight on the water. He turned it over. On the back, Helen had written just one thing: July 76, his favorite shirt. Frank smiled to himself. That green plaid shirt had been worn so many times it eventually fell apart in the wash. Helen had tried to patch the elbows more than once before giving up. So the photo in the package was a copy. Someone had taken it, borrowed it. But how? He went through the rest of the container, looking for names, dates, anything that might tie someone else to that summer. Friends from church, camping buddies, kids from the neighborhood. One boy came to mind. Marcus. Quiet kid. Always alone back then. Used to ride around on a beat-up Schwinn and sit outside the corner hardware store after school. Frank hadn't thought of Marcus in years. He remembered something else, too. One summer afternoon, Helen had noticed Marcus sitting in the heat, looking like he hadn't eaten all day. Frank had made him a sandwich, nothing fancy, just ham and mustard, and dropped it off without a word. The next day the boy was back, and Frank did the same thing. No questions, no lectures, just showed up with food. It became a quiet routine. After a few weeks, the boy disappeared. Frank never asked what happened. He stood and looked at the mailbox through the front window. Could it be? Later that evening he opened the mailbox again, just in case. Another envelope. Same handwriting, no name, no return address. Inside, a short note. You don't remember me, but I remember you. You showed up when no one else did. You didn't ask why. You just noticed. This is me noticing you back. Frank sat down slowly on the bench. The sky was starting to darken. Porch lights flickered on down the street. He read the letter twice, then again. His eyes stung a little. Not from sadness, from something else. Something that felt a lot like being seen. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the same drawer where the photograph now lived. He didn't need to know the sender. Not yet. All he knew was someone remembered. And that made all the difference. Frank didn't sleep much that night. Not because he was restless, but because his mind wouldn't stop turning over the same question. Who had remembered? And why now? The letter was still on the kitchen table when the morning light crept through the window. He read it again, slowly. The words were simple, but they carried weight. You showed up when no one else did. It kept echoing in his head. He'd never thought of what he did back then as anything special. A sandwich here. A few dollars for a kid's bike tube. A repaired hinge on an old neighbor's fence. Things that took minutes. But now, decades later, someone had taken the time to find him. To say thank you. Frank poured his coffee and sat at the table, elbows on the wood. The house was quiet, as always, but the silence didn't feel as hollow as before. It felt like something was waiting. He looked over at the drawer where the photo and letters now sat. It was strange. He hadn't expected anything for his birthday. He'd almost gotten used to that part. What he hadn't expected was for the day to unfold like a conversation with the past. He stepped out into the morning air and stood on the porch. It was cool, calm. The bench looked the same, but now he checked beneath it without even thinking. Nothing there. He walked to the mailbox anyway. Empty. Not surprising, but he opened the door just to check. Back inside, Frank opened his address book. It was old, the pages worn and a few names long since crossed out. He started flipping through it, stopping at the names that tugged at something in his memory. He dialed a few numbers. One didn't work. Another led to a voicemail that didn't give a name. But then he reached David. David had grown up across the street, back when the neighborhood was full of kids on bikes and sprinkler hoses stretched across yards. He answered on the second ring. Hello? David, this is Frank Delaney. Mr. Delaney? Wow, I haven't heard that voice in a while. Everything okay? Frank hesitated. I'm fine. Just had a question. Do you remember a kid named Marcus? Used to hang around the hardware store in the summers. There was a pause. Then David said, Marcus. Yeah. Quiet kid. Always had a wrench in his hand. I think he fixed my handlebars once when I was 10. Frank nodded, though David couldn't see it. I think he might have left something in my mailbox. Another pause. That so? I don't know for sure, but someone did. And they knew things no one else would know. David's tone softened. I remember something about you, Mr. Delaney. My mom always said you were the one who helped people when nobody else noticed. Like when you fixed our screen door without us asking. Or when you left a set of tools for my uncle when his broke. Frank didn't say anything. David continued. Maybe someone's just passing it back. They talked for a few more minutes, then said goodbye. Frank hung up slowly and leaned back in his chair. That idea stayed with him all day. Maybe someone was passing it back. Maybe all those small things he never thought twice about had added up for someone. Maybe Marcus, or whoever this was, had spent years carrying around something they didn't know how to return until now. That evening, Frank did something he hadn't done in years. He sat down with a pen and paper and started to write. Not a thank you letter this time, but a real letter. Dear friend, I've thought about what you said. I didn't think anyone noticed back then. I didn't think it mattered. But maybe it did. I don't know who you are yet, but I'd like to. He folded the letter, slid it into an envelope, and placed it in the mailbox without a stamp. He figured they'd find it, just like the first one. The night settled in. The porch light clicked on. Frank sat outside for a while, hands folded, not expecting anything. But for the first time in a long while, he hoped. It rained the next morning. Not heavy, but steady enough to keep most folks inside. Frank stood by the window with his second cup of coffee, watching water slide down the porch steps. The kind of day that didn't ask anything of you. The kind of day that gave you permission to stay still. He waited until early afternoon to check the mailbox. No umbrella, just his old jacket pulled tight around his shoulders. The gravel was damp beneath his feet. When he opened the mailbox, his breath caught. Another envelope. Same handwriting. He held it for a second before walking back inside, brushing water from the sleeves of his coat as he settled at the table. The envelope was slightly wrinkled from the weather but sealed with care. He opened it slowly, trying not to tear the edges. This one was longer. I was 12. It was early fall. I sat behind the hardware store most afternoons because I didn't want to go home. You never asked why. You just showed up. First with a sandwich, then with a small tool set, then with silence, which I think I needed more than I knew. Frank read the lines twice, then set the paper down, blinking slowly. He remembered that fall. Remembered seeing a kid sitting on the curb most afternoons, knees pulled to his chest. He never said much, just nodded when Frank walked by. You fixed more than a bike. You made me feel like someone saw me. I didn't thank you then. I didn't know how, but I've carried that with me for years. And now, I want you to know, I made something of that kindness. I didn't waste it. Frank let out a quiet breath, then read the last few lines. You didn't ask anything from me, but I needed you to know. That one small act shaped the rest of my life. He sat still for a long time. The sound of rain against the windows filled the house. He folded the letter carefully and slid it next to the others. The room felt different again. Not full exactly, but not empty either. Later that day, his daughter called. The screen lit up with her name, and for a second, he thought about letting it ring. But he answered. "Hey, Dad," she said, voice rushed, background noise behind her. "I've been meaning to call. I'm sorry we didn't reach out on your birthday. The kids were sick, and work's been crazy." He listened, nodded, said it was fine. She offered to come by that weekend, maybe bring lunch. He said sure. After they hung up, he sat quietly for a while. He wasn't angry, not even hurt, but something inside him had shifted. He realized the difference between being remembered because of obligation and being remembered because someone chose to. He picked up his pen and wrote back again. "I do remember you. Not your name yet, but your face. I'm glad you made it. I'm glad you turned it into something. You say I helped you, but you've helped me too. This has meant more than I expected." He paused before finishing. "Let's keep writing." He walked it out to the mailbox and tucked it in carefully. No stamp, no address. Just the same spot, the same quiet rhythm. Back inside, he poured a fresh cup of coffee and opened the drawer. 3 letters now, the photos still tucked beneath them. He hadn't asked for any of this, but someone had decided he was worth remembering. And that, on a rainy afternoon in an empty kitchen, was enough. The next letter came 2 days later. No rain this time, just a breeze sharp enough to rattle the mailbox door before Frank even reached it. He opened it slowly, not because he was tired, but because he was learning to treat these letters like something sacred, like every word inside had been carried across time and silence and carefully placed in his hands. He brought it inside and sat at the table, his hands resting flat on the envelope before opening it. He didn't rush. He let the moment feel like something. The letter was folded once, the same as always. But this time, there was a photograph inside. A more recent one. A man, late 30s, maybe early 40s, stood in front of a small brick building, smiling. In his hands, a set of keys. Above him, a sign, the workshop. Below it, smaller letters read, skills, tools, belief, Frank's brow furrowed as he stared at the image. He set it down gently and unfolded the letter. The words were printed neatly, same handwriting. "This is what I built. It's small, but it's mine. I started it 3 years ago to teach kids how to use tools, how to fix things with their hands. But mostly, I started it to give them what you gave me, a quiet kind of belief. I call it the workshop because that's what you gave me. A place where I learned how to be steady, how to work through things, not just bikes, not just broken stuff, but how to handle being a person." Frank exhaled slowly, hands still on the letter. He remembered teaching shop class back in the day. Woodwork, basic repairs, how to read a tape measure. Some kids took to it, others never paid attention. But he always tried to make the room feel like somewhere they could breathe. Somewhere they weren't being tested, just taught. He looked back at the photo. The man had a calm expression, like someone who had known what it meant to go without, and now wanted to make sure someone else didn't have to. Frank read on. "I don't go by Marcus anymore, at least not outside of letters like this. I changed my name when I left town. Felt like I needed a fresh start. But when I opened the workshop, I remembered what you said to me that day. You probably don't remember saying it. You'd handed me a sandwich and said, 'You've got hands built for something. Might as well use them.' That stuck with me." Frank leaned back in his chair, memory pulling pieces of that afternoon forward. He didn't remember the words exactly, but he remembered the kid. The way he held the sandwich like it might vanish if he blinked. The way his eyes stayed low, like he didn't expect anyone to talk to him, let alone notice him. He'd never imagined that moment meant anything beyond a small act of kindness. But now, decades later, it had turned into something more. The letter closed with one more line. "You didn't know what you gave me, but I've been giving it away ever since." Frank folded the letter carefully, slid it into the drawer with the others, then picked up the photo again. He studied it for a long time. The brick building, the sign, the way the man stood like he belonged there. Then he walked to the bookshelf and pulled out the old photo album Helen had put together years ago. He flipped through until he found the page labeled Neighborhood Projects. A few faded Polaroids, some loose photos from a summer day long gone. One image caught his eye. A small boy, standing beside a bike, grease on his shirt. A grin he hadn't remembered until now. Frank smiled softly, closed the album, and walked back to the table. He picked up his pen. "You've got hands built for something. Turns out I meant that more than I knew. Thank you for reminding me that even small things can matter years later." Then he added one more line. "If you ever feel like coming back, there's still a bench out front, and coffee in the pot." He walked the letter out and placed it gently in the mailbox, hand lingering on the metal before closing the door. The breeze was lighter now, and for the first time in a while, Frank didn't feel like a man remembering the past. He felt like someone still building something. Frank didn't expect a reply right away. He figured some letters took longer than others. Maybe Marcus needed time. Maybe life had pulled him back into the rhythm of running his workshop, managing kids, managing whatever came with being the man he'd grown into. But that didn't bother Frank. He still checked the mailbox every morning. Not out of impatience, just routine now. Something steady. The act of looking had become part of the rhythm of his day, like coffee at 7 o'clock and the news at 6 o'clock. The difference now was the hope tucked inside the habit. 3 days passed, then 4. On the 5th, the envelope was there again. Same handwriting, same careful fold. Frank didn't even make it back to the porch before opening it. He stood at the edge of the driveway, letter trembling slightly in his hands, breeze tugging at the paper as he read. "I almost didn't write again. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know if I could explain what this has meant to me. getting these letters, knowing you remembered, knowing you cared enough to write back. It's strange. I've spent so many years thinking about that version of me, the one who sat behind the hardware store with grease under his nails and too many questions in his head. I don't usually look back on him kindly, but through your words, I've started to see him differently. Not as someone broken, just someone waiting to be seen. Frank paused, letting that line settle. Someone waiting to be seen. He thought about how many people had come through his life like that. Quiet, edged, looking for something they didn't know how to ask for. Marcus had been one of them. Frank read on. You said there's coffee and a bench. I haven't been back in years, but I think I'd like to visit. Just once. Just to say thank you. Properly. And maybe bring a few stories of my own. Frank lowered the letter and looked toward the porch. The bench sat in its usual spot. Faded wood, metal arms dulled with time, but sturdy, dependable. He folded the letter and slipped it into his jacket pocket. The rest of the day moved quietly. Frank found himself doing things he hadn't done in a while. He dusted the bench. Not thoroughly, just enough. Washed out the coffee pot even though it hadn't seen guests in months. He even made a short grocery run, picking up 2 kinds of creamer. He didn't know how Marcus took his coffee, and he figured it was worth being prepared. The next morning he sat on the bench a little earlier than usual, just in case. No one came. He tried again the next day. Still nothing. But by the 3rd morning, just as he was pouring his 2nd cup, he heard it. A car engine. Slow. Careful. The kind of pull-up you notice. He stepped outside as the car parked along the curb. A man stepped out. Frank knew it was him before a word was spoken. Same eyes. Older now. Wiser. A little weathered, but unmistakably the same boy who used to sit with his back to the brick wall, waiting for something that might not come. They stood there for a moment. Not awkwardly, just taking it in. You made it, Frank said. Marcus nodded. Took me long enough. Frank motioned toward the porch. Coffee's hot. Marcus smiled. I figured it would be. They sat, one on each end of the bench, like 2 people who understood silence didn't mean something was missing. For a while, they didn't talk at all. Just watched the morning stretch across the street. And then, slowly, the stories started. The old ones. The ones in between. The ones they'd carried separately for years, but now had the space to share. And just like that, the mailbox wasn't needed. Because the letter had done its job. It had brought someone home. They sat there for hours, the bench barely creaking beneath them. Frank hadn't expected conversation to come easy, but it did. It didn't rush. It didn't push. It just moved, steady and honest, like a river that had been waiting for the dam to lift. Marcus talked about the years after he left town, about how he'd worked odd jobs for a while, trying to stay out of trouble, about how he'd eventually apprenticed with a mechanic who showed him how to rebuild engines and trust people again. Frank listened closely, nodding here and there, but mostly letting the man speak. He learned that Marcus had started the workshop not out of ambition, but out of need. A few kids in his neighborhood had started showing up outside his garage, one with a cracked skateboard, another with a busted lawnmower, and slowly, without planning to, Marcus had started showing up for them the way Frank once showed up for him. They didn't need answers, Marcus said, sipping the 2nd cup of coffee Frank had poured. They just needed someone to hand them a wrench and say, "Try again." Frank smiled quietly. That's the only way I ever learned. They laughed at that, soft and shared. The conversation eventually turned to the photo. Marcus said he found a copy years ago in a stack of things his mother kept in a drawer. Apparently, Frank had given it to her once when they were neighbors. Helen had written something kind on the back of it. I think she said something like, "This is the kind of day we want to remember." Frank felt his chest tighten a little, but he nodded. That sounds like her. There were pauses in the talk, but they weren't empty. They gave space for memory, for the breeze, for two people who hadn't seen each other in decades to sit with the weight of what had been and what had never been said until now. "You know," Marcus said after a long moment, "I almost didn't come. I wasn't sure if you'd even remember me." Frank looked over at him, not with surprise, but with something gentler. "I didn't remember everything," he said, "but I remembered enough. And that photo you sent, that day, Helen made lemonade. We sat on that dock until the sun went down. I didn't know then how many of those quiet moments would matter later." Marcus looked out at the yard, eyes thoughtful. "It mattered to me. Just knowing you remembered someone like me. I didn't think adults noticed kids like that." Frank's voice was steady. "I always noticed the quiet ones. They usually had the most to say, just took longer to hear it." The afternoon wore on. Shadows stretched across the grass. Marcus pulled a small envelope from his jacket. "I brought this," he said, offering it to Frank. "It's from the kids at the workshop. They don't know your name, just that you're the reason it exists." Frank opened it slowly. Inside was a folded piece of paper, crayon signatures, marker hearts, a few smudged lines that looked like grease stains from small hands. "Thank you for building something that built us." Frank stared at the words, throat tight. He folded it gently and held it in his lap. Marcus looked at him. "You showed up when no one else did. I just wanted you to know. I noticed." Frank didn't say anything right away. Then finally, "So did I." They stayed a while longer, until the light began to change. No need to rush. No need to fill the quiet. Sometimes, the best part of a story is just knowing it's still being written. The sun dipped low behind the trees as Marcus stood from the bench, brushing his palms against his jeans like he used to after fixing a bike chain. Frank stood too, a little slower, steadying himself with the armrest. They didn't say much. They didn't have to. Some conversations don't need closing remarks. Some moments don't need to be sealed with promises. They just stay with you, plain and quiet and good. Marcus looked out over the neighborhood, eyes lingering on the places that had once been the edges of his world. The fence where he scraped his knee, the spot near the sidewalk where he learned to ride a bike, the curb where Frank had handed him a sandwich, saying nothing more than, "Eat while it's still cold." "I'll come back," Marcus said, voice low but sure. Frank nodded once. "There's always coffee." They shook hands. Not stiff, not formal, just two people with shared history and full understanding. Then Marcus walked down the steps, opened his car door, and paused for one last look. Frank raised his hand. The car pulled away slow, gravel popping under the tires, taillights flickering once at the end of the drive before turning out of sight. Frank stayed on the porch for a while after that, long enough to let the quiet settle again. But it didn't feel the same anymore. The stillness didn't press in. It gave space instead. He looked out across the yard and then to the mailbox. He didn't expect another letter. Didn't need one. But the next morning there was something waiting. Not a letter. A small box. Wrapped in brown paper and string. A card taped to the top. No envelope. Just one line, written in that same neat handwriting. "You didn't just fix bikes. You fixed people." Frank brought the box inside, set it on the kitchen table, and peeled back the paper. Inside was a wooden plaque. Polished, simple. Carved across the front were the words, "The bench that built a workshop, in honor of Frank Delaney, for noticing what others didn't." He ran his hand across the grain, feeling the weight of it settle in his chest. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't big, but it meant something. Later that afternoon, he went outside with a screwdriver and a handful of screws. It took 10 minutes to mount the plaque to the bench, just below the armrest where his hand naturally rested when he sat. A few neighbors noticed. One couple paused their walk to ask about it. He told them the short version. They nodded and smiled and said, "That sounds like you." The next week, someone left a flower on the bench. The week after, a high school kid sat there after school and ate a sandwich, staring out over the yard like he'd done it before. Word got around. Frank never made a speech, never told the whole story, but people started stopping by more often. Some sat beside him, others just waved from the sidewalk. A few left notes. None signed. None expected replies. It wasn't just about Marcus anymore. It was about the quiet ways people show up for each other. The moments that seem small, but aren't. The kindness that doesn't ask to be remembered, and gets remembered anyway. Frank still lived his life slow, still made coffee at 7, still read the paper, still took his time walking down the driveway. But the world around him felt changed. Not louder, not busier, just fuller. His family eventually asked about the plaque, about the letters. He told them everything, not to guilt them, just so they'd understand. It wasn't about who remembered his birthday. It was about who remembered his kindness. And what it became when someone finally said it out loud. The porch light clicked on. The bench sat steady in the fading light. And Frank smiled, because the silence now sounded like gratitude. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy meaningful stories like this, we'd love to have you as a subscriber.